What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Coin and Geek podcast. This is your host, Eliot Hillis, and I am once again joined by my friend and co-host and kind of co-founder ish.
We co-founded this together.
This, yes, I would.
The
This was an
thing of which,
extension of the defunct Postbit, which was a
right.
weird amalgamation of many failed ideas.
Yeah, it never actually happened. Like
Yeah.
everybody tried and it just inevitably failed. And so the last attempt, we decided, hey, we're gonna go make our own thing.
We did, and then we stopped. Now we're back.
Exactly.
We both decided to go be parents and totally rearrange our lives. But here we are. I'm excited, man. I know we're a little bit late on this. My goal since restarting this has been to try to do at least every other week, but I was sick, and then I don't know what happened again, but we just didn't coordinate. Actually, last time you and I were together, I was completely clean shaven. So
yeah,
that's
back to normal.
Have been at least 6 weeks. Yeah. But I'm excited for this episode because we're going to be talking about something that is near and dear to my heart and maybe to Daniel's, but I'll find that out. And it is Harry Potter, specifically Hogwarts Legacy. Indeed. A lot has been said about this game already, so I'm sure a lot of what we're going to talk about isn't brand new ground. This is simply kind of our perspective. And maybe for those of you guys who are listening or who are just deciding to check this out, maybe one particular differentiator is that we are both Christians, Bible-believing Christians, and some of that may play into how we feel about the whole J.K. Rowling controversy and that surrounding the game itself. So I do want to touch on that and kind of give our thoughts on that. But before we get into that, first, how the heck are you doing, Daniel?
Fine. I'm absolutely fine.
No, that was a large sigh for a fine.
I messed up my back. It was like
it's starting. It's starting. How old are you? 33?
34 now.
No, yeah, it's all downhill.
Yeah. Well, see, like I aged, being in the military and other various physically intensive jobs I've had. I feel like I've aged faster than if I had just been.
As Indiana Jones once said, "It's not the years, honey, it's the mileage."
Exactly. So. But that put me out of commission for like a week, so I wasn't even really able to draw or do anything that I enjoy doing. And now I'm finally back, but
yeah, you're back.
Back drawing.
With your back fixed,
right.
Hopefully.
That's right, absolutely. Forever. It's never gonna get hurt again.
Dude, I totally understand. I've actually had slinging back issues since I was in my early 20s. And so nothing is bad. I haven't had anything really bad in a long time, but it's persistent. So I understand that. Well, I'm glad to have you here. Again, we're talking about Hogwarts Legacy, the game that was developed by Avalanche. And before we get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about our own personal history with Harry Potter and sort of memories, feelings of it, attachments, not attachments. I'll let Daniel go first. Kind of give me your thoughts just in general on Harry Potter. Were you a fan of the books? What's kind of your experience growing up?
I was in 5th grade, and my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Grider, she was reading the book to us in class. And people complained about it being read to kids. It was very controversial at the time.
Did you go to a Christian school?
I did not for 5th grade. I
Oh.
did for most of my elementary school years, but in 5th grade, I went to a public school. And it was the big popular book at the time. Everybody was reading it, and the teacher wanted kids to have a joy of reading, and so she was reading it to us in class.
Sure.
Well, my parents in particular didn't want us to read it. They were at the time very opposed to depictions of magic, of witchcraft, of anything with a cult or anything like that. And they had been for some time. There was a lot of Disney movies I never saw until I was older. And that's just how my parents operated. We were much more into science fiction than ever we were fantasy stuff. The only fantasy things I ever read were Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
Never watched any movies that I'd watched some King Arthur stuff maybe, or just random stuff like that. For the most part, if it had magic in it, my parents didn't want us to watch it.
Sure.
And so I never read Harry Potter or knew really anything about it until I was an adult.
Mhm.
And then I decided, oh, well, I'll check out these movies, Harry Potter movies. And I watched the movies and I thought, well, these are kind of cool. And then I read the books. And over time, my parents have now seen the movies and they're like, oh, these are pretty good. And my wife's family was the same way. I think they weren't as dogmatic about depictions of magic, but I don't think they were really let their kids read Harry Potter, but they were mostly, they had never watched them, and they watched them and they told like, oh, I get this. I understand why everybody from that generation loved these things. Like they could see it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting that when they finally got around to seeing it, they're like, oh, now I understand why everybody likes it. And it really was for our generation that grew up with VHS tapes and having access to everything in the past. We kind of absorbed the pop culture of the past, where we watched Star Trek on television, the old, the original series. We saw reruns. We were watching Next Generation, and we were also seeing things like Star Wars that maybe you were not quite alive yet, or very little when the last Star Wars movie came out.
Yeah,
but I wasn't even alive, and but we saw them on VHS, and so they were meaningful to youngsters. But Harry Potter was the first thing for our generation. Like we were the tail end of Ninja Turtles. We missed the real big G.I. Joe boom and Transformers, but we're on the tail end of those things. And then Harry Potter came out, and it's this huge cultural milestone. So everybody from about your age to a little bit younger than me is just was huge into Harry Potter. It was their thing. And so that's
your experience. So do you have any like real great affinity for it, or is this something that's you generally enjoy it, but maybe
I have like the illustrated editions, and I've got all of this stuff. So I've become more into it as a person who likes to create things, whether it's writing or drawing comics or whatever. I really admire the world building of it. And I think some of the themes in the original Harry Potter series are really good. I think there's some really great stuff in it.
I have the same books sitting over there.
Yeah, whenever these come out, like I got to go pick it up. The fact that it's painted and illustrated, and it's fantastic.
Now, here's a question, and I am going to get to my own opinion, but are you planning on reading them to your kids when they're old enough?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have my parents have way since mellowed and changed on the whole magic thing. And I think that's in part because of me. Like nowadays, my mom reads like fantasy books, Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss. Like she's like really into fantasy books now. So times have changed, but I really like the idea of reading to my kids. Right now, my son and I are reading Redwall. So we're starting out with something like that. And eventually, when I think they're old enough, we'll start reading these. And that's part of the reason why I got these nice illustrated editions to
that's actually the same reason I did. Yeah, we wanted to get a nice Harry Potter set for a while, and then I was like, the illustrated ones would be cool because that was my introduction to reading growing up. We had books and books with pictures, but it's cool that it's not abridged or anything. It's the full version. It just has, and I think the artwork's cool. So I'll give you my history with it. So I heard about Harry Potter when I was like 19. I knew the books existed, but I know the books existed before that. But this would have been, for some context, this was like 2000, 2001. When I heard about it, it was kind of going around that this was like the next Lord of the Rings. That's what was being said. Now I grew up, quote unquote. I say grow up, but I really got into Lord of the Rings like in high school. I discovered that through the cartoons, like the Rankin and Bass.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Cartoons. Yeah, I was introduced to it through that, and I had always dreamed about how could they make a Lord of the Rings movie? Like, how would this ever work?
Mhm.
And so I read the books, and I wasn't, and I'm still not much of a reader, but I really loved Lord of the Rings. And then the Lord of the Rings movies, like Fellowship of the Ring and Sorcerer's Stone, I think came out the same year. And I remember almost being personally offended because it was like, this doesn't even sniff Lord of the Rings. Like, Lord of the Rings is so much better than this. And I was like, what is this goofy little, like, kids thing? Like, it was fine. I didn't hate it, but I kind of had a grudge against it because I was like, this just isn't Lord of the Rings, like, not even close. So for years I sort of ignored it, and I never read the books, but it was always in pop culture. I do have some funny memories. The whole controversy around that, especially in like Christian communities, was a big deal. Probably still is in some, but the whole thing about witchcraft and everything was a real thing. So like in the 90s, especially in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, parents were kind of introduced to this whole thing through like Dungeons and Dragons. There was a big kind of, hubbub about that. Parents freaking out that it was, getting kids to perform witchcraft and magic. And I remember my dad in particular being very strongly against that. I never really understood why. He just didn't want us playing it. And so my parents were really conservative, but they weren't always very consistent, because I did get to watch Disney movies and I did get to watch Star Wars. And I was kind of like, well, Harry Potter and Star Wars are kind of the same thing when it comes to magic. It's like they're kind of both sourced in this like mystical thing, right? So I understand there's more practicality to it, and witchcraft is a real thing, whereas the Force isn't. But so that I remember in my parents' church, the church I grew up in, the head pastor taught a whole sermon about why we should boycott Harry Potter. A whole sermon. And I really was like, dude, this is so stupid. I was like, I hate this. Like, I was very, I was a public school kid. We had a lot of homeschoolers. I always kind of felt like, oh, we're the bad kids, even though we weren't really bad. We were just normal. But it was like, oh yeah, this and that. So all that being said, I didn't see the second or third Harry Potter movie in the theaters, and I hadn't read any of the books. And I went and saw Harry Potter again with the Goblet of Fire. And that was like I think I had seen the other two movies. I rented them, and I started to kind of get into it there. And then Goblet of Fire came out. And then I don't know what spawned my interest in reading the books, but at some point there in my early to mid 20s, I decided I was going to try reading these books, and I got really into them. I was shocked at how good they were, and how just very readable they are, and how well written. One thing I was really impressed with, especially as I went further along, was that the tone shifted to something more childlike and whimsical to something more serious, and eventually pretty dark. And I think the thing that sticks with me about this is that J.K. Rowling had really captured what it felt like to be that age. So if anybody for some reason doesn't know how these books work, every book is basically a year, basically from 10 to 17, 18-ish. And so I was like, wow, that's what I felt like as a 10-year-old. Oh, I remember thinking that way when I was a teen. And I remember feeling angsty and like all this stuff. And so she did such a great job of that in encapsulating all this other world building. So my love for the books then translated into the love for the movies. And so now I'm just like, I really appreciate this, because I feel like there's also so little of that today, at least in pop culture, where my wife and I basically watch through the movies every year. And we own the books. I haven't read the books in a long time, but we definitely plan on reading them to my daughters when they're older. And I'm excited to do that, because I think it's really cool storytelling and really cool world building. So I am a fan. I'm not like a super fan or anything. I don't have any other Harry Potter paraphernalia. Yeah. It's way outside of like, if Star Wars is up here and Lord of the Rings is up here, like Harry Potter's down here. But I do recognize that Harry Potter's quality, at least to me. And so I never saw the Fantastic Beasts. I think those were less well received. And I tried to watch one a little bit, and I just wasn't into it. It just didn't speak to me. But bringing it full circle, I was interested in this Harry Potter game. And actually, I think I had posted something on the Coin Geek channel when they first released like the teaser trailer for it, and Daniel commented on it, and you're like, I'm excited about this. Like, I want to play this game. And there is something about Harry Potter, whether it's the music or the setting, there's something about it that's, pardon the pun, a bit magical. And I really felt like that initial trailer was like, I'm ready to go back into this world. So I've been excited to play this game for a while. And I'll save my thoughts for that for a little later. But Daniel, when you first saw the trailer, when you first heard this game was coming out, how did you feel about it?
Oh, cautiously optimistic, like I am with most games. I don't play a ton of new releases. Definitely don't play a lot of AAA games. That's kind of been the history of this podcast, is me talking about whatever like indie game or years old game that I'm currently playing. Mm-hmm. I've never been a guy. I didn't have video game consoles growing up. For anybody that's just new to the podcast, I had a PC later in, when I was fifth grade, about that time, we got a PC. And so I started playing PC games. Most of that was older stuff. It was inexpensive and very little ROMs and things like that. So for me, the idea of going out and buying whatever new game is coming out and playing that, I've never done it. I've always bought games on discount. I've always bought them used. I've never traded anything in. I have pretty much every game I've ever bought. So for me, like when I see a new release coming out, I'm like, okay, what are the odds I'm going to buy this full price? Very low. But with this, I'm like, well, I want to play this. It's Harry Potter. Like, you get to walk around Hogwarts potentially. This could be really cool. But knowing the trajectory of pop culture and the way that things had been going, I'm very skeptical about the video game industry in general, especially when it's a big release from a big property. We saw what happened with the Marvel games that were coming out, and they're just nonsense. Garbage games, garbage stories, garbage politics put into them. Just garbage. And there's always a few bright spots every once in a while that are well received, that are licensed games, but generally licensed games have been pretty bad. Mm-hmm. So cautiously optimistic was my first thought.
Okay. I was probably more optimistic. Now I'm the opposite of you. I grew up like you. I didn't have new consoles until the very first PlayStation. And that was like, I had a Game Boy all growing up. And then PlayStation was like my first real console that was ours. It wasn't like a hand-me-down or something somebody gave me. It was like, well, we got this for Christmas and this was our console. Mm. So that was like, and that's probably partially why I'm still attached to PlayStation like I am. But that being said, and as an adult, you can buy what you want if you want to. And if there's a game I'm interested in, I'll buy it. And I was definitely interested in this. And I think, the trailers, it's hard to tell at that time because I actually don't know. I can't remember if the consoles had been released or not, or if they are still on their way. But I just remember thinking graphically the game looked really good and the production value was really high. Now when the actual game came out, it doesn't look like that. It looks good, but not like that. And I was getting a little bit worried with the lead up to the game because they do these sort of, when there's a big game like this, they'll have various media outlets that'll get special time with the game, and they'll do these little, hey, we're gonna spend 30 minutes showing you the game. And what I saw of that wasn't super impressive, and at least in the early stages. But I was impressed by the open worldness of it, like how big the game was. And that's kind of like maybe part of a criticism that I'll lobby at it in a bit. But the game was way bigger than I thought it was going to be. And you hear a game called Hogwarts Legacy, you think, okay, well, this game's going to be primarily in Hogwarts. And I wasn't sure how the combat was going to work. And so by the time the game came out, I was still interested, but I wasn't to the point where I was going to purchase it yet until most reviews were coming out and saying, well, this game's really, really great. And there had been a pretty big dry spell in terms of new games. Hadn't really been much coming out due to pandemic, blah, 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 everything else. So many games that were supposed to come out last year all got kind of shoved into this, this year. So we're seeing a lot of stuff now come out that are huge games. It's going to be a crazy year for games, but this was, in my opinion, like the first of that sort of trickle effect. So I was anxious to get my hands on it. Now I'm going to start getting into the game itself. I do want to talk about some of the controversy about it, but I want to just give you my impressions of the game before we talk about the controversy, the quote unquote controversy. The game came out. I think it's really good. I think I was impressed by the production value of it. I really like the opening. I really enjoy some of the vistas and some of just the imagery. You've played, how far have you gotten into it, Daniel? I know your wife's playing it, but
not that far. We just had so much going on since we got the game.
Yeah,
we've played some of it, and I've watched her play some of it. But we haven't gotten too far into it.
Yeah. Well, you played the opening. This is right at the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler. But some big event happens, and you find yourself basically on what seems to be like an island or something like that. And I remember you have to like rebuild it, or the guy rebuilds the bridge, and it's like in this kind of almost like lighthouse feel where there's these waves crashing, and he builds this bridge. And I just remember it being, and I was like, wow, this is really kind of cool. Like I love the imagery, and I just felt like I was in that world. So right off the bat, I was impressed with that. And the music is really good. Especially at certain key points in the game where they're purposely obviously ramping it up for a feeling. Like when you get your broom, and there's a few other segments like that where I thought that was really good. I think the voice acting is pretty good for the most part. It is open world, and you can choose a male or female voice. I'm playing as a male. It was a little weird. Like you can do like a tonal adjustment. I tried to give my guy a little bit more of a bass voice. But you could hear, I don't know what you would call it, but you can hear how it sounds synthetic. There's some weird effect that happens when you move his voice into a lower register that doesn't make it, that makes it sound like it's clearly being modified. And I'm like, that's interesting that happened. I don't know if they patched it out. But it was like, yeah, I can't keep it here because it sounds synthetic. It sounds like a robot voice. So there were things like that. And I think there's also things where Avalanche isn't known anymore as being like a AAA developer. This is kind of a really big game for them. And it's hard for me to tell whether or not the game suffers because of their development, or if it suffers because it's trying to do too much, even on current gen hardware, which is kind of why I'm sort of curious about the PS4 version and even the Switch version. Like, how are they ever going to make this game work? Because having a PS5 and you having a Series X, you can set it to either performance or graphic mode, which allows you to change the frame rate from 30 to 60. If you have a high definition television. So I always like to play in performance mode. So I was running it with the higher frame rate. Overall, I think the game ran well enough, but it still felt like maybe this is a little bit buggy. So anyway, I want to just say that I think overall the game was good. I really actually liked the combat a lot. It was hard. It took me a little while to get used to like, okay, I really actually have to think about this more than I thought I did. I thought I could kind of mash a little more, but because of how the characters are, and if they put up certain shields, you have to use a certain spell type to disable that shield, and then use certain attacks. Once I got the rhythm of it, I was enjoying it, but it was harder than I thought. I don't want to talk too deeply about story, but I will say that story-wise, I think the game is good. I think it adds to the overall Harry Potter lore, but it's also like, it also stands on its own. Like in my opinion, if you haven't, I don't know why you would play this game if you've never seen Harry Potter or read it, because there's like a lot of things in there that
very few people.
Yeah, it's totally for the fans, but I say that in a way where it's like only tangentially, meaning that like Dumbledore's not going to show up in that, and you're not going to find something where it's like directly related to the Harry Potter stories outside of like, this is Hogwarts and I recognize these set pieces, and oh yeah, I remember hearing about this reference of this thing. But it's never like, it's not one of those things where like you have to see Harry Potter to understand the story of what's going on here. So I appreciated that, and I thought overall it was well done in that regard. I've been talking a lot. I do want to come back and talk about a few other things, but overall I'd say I really liked it and it was worth the purchase. But your experience with it so far, Daniel, how are you and your wife enjoying it?
Also, my wife plays a lot of RPGs because when she's taking care of little ones, nursing, that kind of thing, uh, she can sit there and play an RPG and shouldn't have to really, it can be easily paused and just, you don't have to do much. So she has played through the Mass Effect games and through just other random RPGs I've bought her. There's a fairy tale one on Switch that I got her, and like, so we got this with that in mind. That's why we got it early.
Yeah.
I was planning on getting it on the Switch, and then we got it for the Xbox, and because it was coming out before that on the Xbox. But mostly she's enjoying the gameplay because she's finding it, the world interesting and the ability to move around within the Harry Potter world to be fun.
Yeah. What do you think about okay, for a game like that's called Hogwarts Legacy? I'm going to get into a little bit more of my criticisms. I feel like the game mostly, especially with the actual story beats, seems to take place outside of Hogwarts.
Yeah.
Is that something that stuck out to you?
It is kind of interesting. Like when I go in there and she's not running around Hogwarts, like to me, the appeal of the game, and I think why people want to play it, is to run around Hogwarts.
Yeah.
They want to be in that place. It's every kid was like, man, wouldn't it be cool to go to be a student at Hogwarts?
Yeah.
And when you take the gameplay out of there, you're kind of taking it away from the core reason why people want it. Now, if it's a good game, if it's actually still fun to play, then it's fine. But there's a reason why the Harry Potter books took place mostly at Hogwarts, right? Until the last one, you're in the school for the entire book. And this school becomes almost another character. That setting is so important. So that's why people want the game, is to stay in Hogwarts.
Yeah. I think one thing that stuck out to me about this is that it's much more of like, I think it's a lot closer to The Witcher than it is to Persona. And I think Persona is kind of a feel that I think they could have mimicked a little more in terms of like, hey, if you really want to be invested in Hogwarts, you could kind of like, you're not really playing, you're playing as a student, but none of the rules of being a student apply to you. You can go out whenever you want. There's like, you're not having to attend classes. And I understand that's probably kind of tedious. And I understand from a gameplay standpoint, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense in some ways. But I do think like if they were going to make a second one, they could probably, I'm sure they will, because it's been hugely successful. Yeah. Like I would be shocked if they didn't make another one.
It's interesting. You talk about like games in some ways have become easier and less expansive as they've gone along, which is kind of crazy considering the level of technology has gone up. You ever talk to someone who was really into Morrowind and they're like, yeah, Skyrim's basically like the baby version of Morrowind. Like there's features and things that go backwards. Like there was a lot of people that were big fans of the Mafia games, and then they remade Mafia and they took out all of the open world, like freedom things that you had and made it feel more like your hand was being held. When you booted up Final Fantasy 1 for the first time back in the day, and you're like, what do I do? Where do I go? You go in the forest and there's the boss, like the end boss just like totally wipes you out. And you're like, wait, what was I like? What am I supposed to do? Like, I just got destroyed by the first enemy I found.
Yeah.
There was a part of the enjoyment of the game was figuring it out. What are you supposed to do? Like I think about the first Pokemon game, and you had to go and talk to the characters and go find things and figure, oh, I need this to open this. And a lot of games nowadays, they have the little like glowing lights that you follow, or they've got a map that says go here, and doesn't really get you to go around. But I think one of the interesting things is something like Hogwarts Legacy, where the game is I mean, the characters' names, like they don't matter. Like
Right.
whatever the classmates are, they don't matter. What matters is that you are a wizard in Hogwarts. And
Mhm.
to me, it seems it would make more sense to have things centered around discovering things about the school, interacting with, like growing as a character. And they just don't make games like that, it feels like. So often, a
Yeah.
lot of these AAA games are stripped down in order to make them mass appeal rather than making like this really great game with this in-depth system.
Yeah, it's a hard bridge to cross, I think, especially with a property like Harry Potter, because you are getting a mass appeal regardless of whether
Yeah.
you want to or not, right? Like the very name Harry Potter is going to invoke people of all ages. And I think there's a world, like the older I get, the less time I have for the games that you're describing. I still haven't finished. I've started Breath of the Wild 7 times and I still haven't finished it.
I'm just not even going to buy it. Like an
I
open
mean,
world Zelda, there's no chance I'll ever
yeah,
beat
well,
it.
that's the whole thing, right? Like that is exactly what you described. Like, hey, I'm just going to start and I have to wander around and find things. And I'm just like, I just don't have the time for that. So I think that's fine, and it's highly rated. And like Elden Ring's another one of these games that was Game of the Year, and that's like one of the big selling points. But and I will play Elden Ring at some point because I feel like I need to try it. But it's also just one of those games that's like, dude, it just sounds like a second job. Like I have to dedicate all this time to it. So I've been at this point in my life now where I'm kind of beelining it to try to make it through the story of games because I do care most about the story. And then if I have time, I'll go back and do some of these other side quests. But I just think the way the game is built, this feels like the game is built mostly to take you outside. Like there are some quests that do take place within Hogwarts, but I feel like they're few and far between, or they're like kind of side questy type of things. And it's like, well, hey, you go to Hogsmeade for this, or you go to this, and it's like these other areas that you discover, which I think is cool, but it doesn't really. If the point of the game is for you to be a student and experience what it's like being a student, you're basically experiencing what it's like to be an Auror more than an actual student.
Yeah, and
Where
that's
it's like you're going around destroying things.
something I was just thinking about is within this kind of game, you have to have enemies to fight. It's an action game. It's not just an adventure game. You're not playing King's Quest,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
you're not just going around and finding the cheese to throw down to the to save the rat and all this other stuff. No,
Sure.
stop the cat from killing the mouse to save yourself from the prison. Like, no, you're
Yeah.
not doing that stuff. You're fighting, and that's
Mhm.
the kind of game that is going to sell. And so there are things they have to do, like how do you get enemies into Hogwarts? Now, back in the day when the game was on the PlayStation 1, it doesn't matter. It's no one questions why there's a bunch of random enemies you have to fight, or it's like it's not it's not a one-to-one thing. But now that the
Yeah.
technology has reached where you can recreate the entirety of Hogwarts as it appears in the movies, and you can travel around the whole building, it they have to find reasons for there to be enemies there.
Yeah.
And that is one thing that like the person has to take into account when they play something like this is like if you make a
It
Star
is a
Trek
game
game,
after all. Yeah.
like you make a Star Trek game today, what are you gonna do? Like, like you
Right.
just
Yeah.
Star Trek's not about fighting people, so how do you do it? They're not
Yeah.
gonna.
Probably Eve Online's probably a better Star Trek than any Star
Yeah,
Trek game.
exactly. Right.
It's like
You go.
nobody has time for that.
Yeah, it's
No,
like they always just make ship combat games. Nobody wants to play any ship combat games. So Star Trek's like not a video game franchise that anyone wants to play.
yeah, exactly. Well, and I think but I think all that being said, I still think it works well for what it is.
Mhm.
I do think one thing I do want to say, you mentioned about the characters. There's only one character in the game that you meet that I think it really stands out. It's another guy named Sebastian who's like a Slytherin guy, and he has a really interesting side quest. And you do follow him throughout these side quests, which I them being side quests, I guess they're optional, but his character is interesting because he's kind of one of these sort of, he's your friend, but he's kind of got this dark side, but it's kind of understandable. So it's sort of like this gray area. It makes him interesting. There are like 2 other companions that kind of you follow through on multiple side quests and kind of get to know their story, and their stories are a little less interesting. I do think that one other thing about Harry Potter that people remember is people remember Hermione and Ron, in the same conversation, and those are the people that largely shape who Harry is and make him and keep him grounded, right? And I know, again, this is a different thing, but if they were to improve on it, I would love to see stronger characters that are with you more often, right. Guys that are like, they're your companions. It's not a turn-based RPG, so you're not going to run around with a party probably. But I do think that it would be good that they came along with you on like the main quests and they weren't just like a side quest thing, because that makes you feel fairly alone throughout this whole thing. And that's also sort of, in my opinion, a disconnect of trying to be a student and trying to be involved and like continuing that Harry Potter experience, which again, on a production level, they did so well. But I think back on the story, I'm like, do I really love this story? Do I want to spend more time with these characters? And it's kind of like, well, outside of maybe Sebastian, I don't really know that I need to see any of these people again. And to me, that's sort of like, okay, that makes it a good game, but it keeps it from being a great game.
Well, just as you describe those things, and I think about that game, I think about things like BioWare games, how they used to be. They don't. BioWare doesn't exist anymore.
Yes,
it doesn't even. It's so irrelevant now.
That's another podcast.
Mass Effect or the Knights of the Old Republic type thing, where the side characters that your party, they mattered. They really mattered, and you grew attached to them. Like, my brother always played with Talia, and I always played with like Ashley Williams, and like our party was structured around like these various characters and what they did. And like Caden Linko, he got to go, dog. Like, no, choosing Ashley. But it matters. And like, if you don't, like when my wife's go through, I'm like, hey, just choose this, like choose this path, or I'm, and you'll be satisfied. And so like, there's been games like that. And I think a modern one, that a franchise that still exists, a company that still makes games, is Atlas with the Persona series. The side characters in the Persona games, I always feel like I know them.
Yeah.
And Persona, you go to school, sometimes you have classes or whatever, and a lot of those games are about building relationships with those characters, and it never feels tedious. It always feels like it's worth your time to invest. And you look at something like that formula for Harry Potter, it's like that could have worked. Something like that, where the things you're doing, you see the effects as the characters get stronger and your relationships with them are built. So there are things that do some of the things we're talking about here, but I don't know. It's interesting to see the design choices that things go with, and you don't see a lot of games like Persona except for Persona.
Yeah.
You don't see things like what BioWare was doing. They don't make them anymore.
Yeah. And I think maybe, I think going back to did Avalanche accomplish what they set out to do? I think they did, and I think they did it pretty well. I think they've earned another shot at this. I think the sales speak for that, regardless of what you or I think about it.
Yeah.
And my wife's not a gamer, but she perks up when that game's on. She's like, "Oh, I'm interested." Like, she kind of wants to play it, and so there is something about that. There is an appeal to it. But I do think that we need to see, going forward, if they're going to continue with this, I want to see these things get better. It's just kind of like Harry Potter itself is obviously not a new name or a franchise. And it's not the first Harry Potter game. There's been Harry Potter games before it, but it's the first in the Hogwarts Legacy series. So this is kind of like almost in some ways a proof of concept, where it's like, hey, we can actually do this. So my hope is that they can, and whatever the next game is, and I wouldn't mind them doing a whole completely different story. Like, I don't feel like we need to revisit this character and this like particular storyline again necessarily. Like, I think it ended fine. And I think it could just be something totally separate, and I would be completely cool with that, because I don't think the structure of it, you brought up Mass Effect, which was clearly leading into games 2 and 3, where you're like, yeah, like this is setting up a big story. This is not doing that. This is kind of like, okay, this could be, they could, but it doesn't to me, it's like, you could just start fresh, especially being that you're creating your character and do something different. I do want to get into, so overall, I would say I liked it, and I'm glad I bought it. And I tried to go back and play a little bit of the extra content, but I think after I finished it, I wasn't feeling super motivated. Some of it was kind of tedious, and this is another kind of, in my opinion, a problem with just open world stuff in general. I would talk about Horizon, which is a PlayStation only franchise. It's really, I mean,
it's on PC too.
Oh yeah, you're right. It is on PC now. Production value.
I've never even played that Xbox Series X. I've never even played a game on it. Only my wife has. Like I got a PC in here, plays everything these days. What do I need to go out there for?
That's true. True. But similar to the way I felt in that game, Forbidden West, the newest one that came out, where it was like, dude, this game is so well put together in so many ways, but the world is just it's totally trying to distract me all the time from like just getting through the story. And by the time I got through the story, I was like, okay, cool. Now I can go back, and I'm like, wait, I like this is overwhelming to me. If I played 2 games a year, yeah, I'd be all into it, but I'm ready for the next thing. And I felt like that with Harry Potter. I was like, I'm ready. I'm done. Like I can go on to the next thing. And maybe I'm just getting old, and I have less time. Obviously, I do have less time because I have a kid and I've got another one on the way. So it's just like my time for these things is less and less. But I am playing through a separate game, Octopath Traveler 2. It's a much more simplified game. It's freaking awesome, and I want to do everything in that game. And I'm just like, and it's just like super basic in a lot of ways. But it speaks to me in some of these ways that where some of this stuff just feels like this is just for the completionist, or they're trying to take like the Skyrim approach where everything wants to be Skyrim, where you just spend thousands and thousands of hours. And it's like, I don't think some of these games earn that. And there's only so many of those games that can exist that can beg for your time in that way. Like there's only so much of me to go around. I don't have time to give like what I gave to Skyrim, when I was in my early 30s, late 20s, to every single open world game that comes out. So that's my overall thought. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just coughing.
Sorry,
just clearing my throat.
Okay,
totally unrelated.
Yeah, I do want to ask you your opinion about this. So shortly before the game came out, there was a big push for a boycott. Mm-hmm. The boycott comes from people who have a problem with J.K. Rowling, Rowling, I say Rowling, and who have, made claims that she's transphobic, basically for just being a normal human being that said that, only women.
She's a TERF, man. She's a trans exclusionary
See, I didn't even know that was a
trans excluding reactionary feminist.
I didn't even know that was a thing until this came out, which is hilarious to me because I remember being upset when after the Harry Potter series was done, she came out and said that Dumbledore was gay. And I was like, why? Like, why? Like this never had anything. Like, it's so stupid that you added this. And I stand by that. I think it's so stupid. And I was like, well, she's just pandering to this particular audience. But now she's like, but I mean, I don't agree with her there, but at least I have respect for, she probably has a real conviction about homosexuality that I don't share. But she also has like a line where I don't think she's pandering. It would be too easy for her to pander considering the circumstances. Now she's like a billionaire. She probably doesn't need any money or anything. It's probably not hard for her to like say, hey, whatever, you buy this game and I'm getting a check cut to me. So I don't think there's a financial risk for her there. But I did find it interesting that, especially in the world that we live in, we're seeing this weird push, right, for inclusion for every type of race, every type of sexuality, any kind of thing that, even if it doesn't make any sense. And that is, it's funny because of all that thing, there is a trans character in the game.
Yep. My wife just found them.
Yeah.
Right before this, she's like, hey, Daniel, come out here. I'll show you something.
And it's just silly. That whole thing is so silly. But I'm curious, Daniel, I'm not going to ask you specifics. I just want to know, like, what are your raw feelings about everything surrounding that?
I think it's hilarious.
Yes.
It's hilarious. This game was always going to sell. Like I said, for people of our generation, this is the franchise. This is huge. It's the first time there's been anything like this. And it was always going to sell. It was always going to sell crazy big numbers because people were going to get it who they didn't play games. They just wanted to play Harry Potter. Or if they do play games, they're like, oh, I'm definitely getting that. And then you had a bunch of free publicity where people that didn't hear about the game, like that care about this culture war or whatever they want to call it, they're like, well, I'm going to get the game now. And it was always going to sell. It was always going to sell huge. And the boycott only could have helped. It no way was ever going to hurt. It was never going to do any damage to it because it was so huge. But like you pointed out, it actually has the quote unquote woke agenda in the game. There is a push towards a multicultural representation in the game, which when you think about the history of England, it's like, yeah, I guess every single magical person of any ethnicity that lived in England at the time would go to Hogwarts. But how, like,
right.
It feels off because
it does feel off for sure.
And when you have professors and things, it's like, I try not to be one of these people that really analyzes pop culture worlds and like finds holes in them. I remember there was this acquaintance of mine. I don't think he'd call himself my friend, but he was analyzing the physics of Pacific Rim, like the in-world physics of the movie Pacific Rim, to try to explain this thing. And I was like, it's just bad writing, man. Like they didn't think that all the way through. Like, why are you wasting your time thinking about this? But one of the things that's interesting to me is one of the things that J.K. Rowling did with this series that was interesting was make there be kind of real world parallels. Like you heard that there was a big war around the time of World War II, and it had to do with magical versus non-magical and different people groups and stuff. And that's, it's dealing with the same kind of things that happen in the real world with World War II. So this idea that like, no, the whole world was homogenous in 1800s England, or Scotland, I think is actually technically where Hogwarts is. But in Great Britain, everyone was homogenous and happy and like multicultural. And it's like, I mean, no. So it's one of those that starts to take you out of things when they force that kind of stuff in it. And I want to be immersed in a game. When I play a Persona game set in Japan, I don't expect there to be an American. When there is, I'm like, that's kind of weird. Like, let's see how they represent America. Like, let's see how they actually portray it. But I'm not expecting it. I don't expect to have this huge multicultural cast. When I watch a show produced in Japan, I expect it to have Japanese characters or people with Japanese sensibilities because that's where it's produced. And this push towards representation, this forced representation, all it does is destroy immersion. It destroys world building. It forces things to feel off and not right. There's that show, Wheel of Time, which was on Amazon. It's an adaptation of the book series by Robert Jordan. And I tried watching it, and it's bad. It's like, it's on par with the old Hercules or Xena type of like cheesiness, but it's not supposed to be cheesy, right? But the thing that got me was they're in this tiny little hamlet in the middle of nowhere in this country, and there's people of it's predominantly Black people that live in this tiny village that looks like Europe, and they are every shade of Black, from really dark skin to really light skin. And then there's like Asians, and you're like, how do all these people that look totally different from each other live in this tiny little village? And like, that's not how anything works. Like if I went back in time to the middle of Africa, I'm not going to find somebody that looks like myself unless they're an albino. Like, same if I go to the middle of of Ireland, the only possible change in both of those places is that there might be somebody from a different tribe somewhere else that's a slave, like to that tribe. So like that's the different ethnicity that's represented. That's the reality of the world. So these things often take me out of it. And I want immersion when I'm playing a game. I like the game Football Manager because I want to feel like I'm actually the head coach of a soccer team in England, and like I get to make all the decisions on who I recruit and what tactic we use and all of this stuff. And I really like that game because it's so in depth. That's what I enjoy about games. And so it's kind of funny that there was this big controversy about how J.K. Rowling's a TERF and we don't want to give her any money and blah, blah, blah. But the game itself is woke.
Yeah.
The people who made it agree with the people that wanted to boycott them.
Yeah.
And that is wrongly they did, because these people aren't their friends. Obviously, they wanted to destroy their livelihoods. They wanted them to lose their jobs. They wanted them to get laid off, all to hurt J.K. Rowling. And, you know, she now finds herself being castigated and basically eaten by the very people that she once thought, I'm going to champion them by saying that Dumbledore was gay. And I'm just a good liberal. And now she's being destroyed because they went past her breaking point, like you pointed out.
It's just revealing of the heart of man, right? Like wickedness knows no end. And I think, you know, as Christians, we can both sit here and we can say, we know where the problem is. This is not mental illness. This is not, I mean, maybe some of that's involved somewhere, but this is just straight up sinfulness, and sinfulness just always wants more and more. It's never satisfied. And ask anybody who's ever been addicted to porn. There's never a breaking point. Like if you wanted to, you just keep going. And it's the same thing here. I'm thankful that our world isn't so broken at this point to where everybody was just like, yeah, we'll all stop. You know, if they had been successful, I would have been very much more displeased. But what you're pointing out is what I find kind of funny in a way where, hey, like this actually had the opposite reaction, and people were going out and buying multiple copies to fight against this. And just the ridiculous nature of it. And yeah, I'm glad you brought it back to the game itself in terms of its multicultural emphasis, because that's true. And I didn't even talk about that in my little brief overview, but you're right. And I think we should probably talk about this on another podcast where we just talk about this subject, but there is this push to be inclusive over authentic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like your authenticity suffers because you can't hold both in your hand at the same time.
Just think about just a few console generations ago, we had Assassin's Creed, the first Assassin's Creed game, and you're playing a Muslim, like killing Christians. And like nobody cared. It was just a game. And you're like, man, this is cool. Like this is representing the obviously like sci-fi, and Assassins was fake. It's a game, but like it's trying to represent everything accurately to some degree. And those games have kind of gone fairly in line, you know, like you have one in Greece, it's going to have Greeks for the most part. Like, yeah, but then even there, you start to see those things creep in. It wasn't that long ago that people wanted to be authentic. There's no problem with a game featuring Black characters. Like nobody cares if the game is good and it makes sense. The problem is when they start to force these things. I think about like The Witcher is a Polish book that was made into a game, and then they make it into a TV show, and suddenly like the cast is multicultural, and it's like, well, what happened to the Polishness of it? Like, you know, like I'm pretty sure that the Poles look a certain way, and that's not, you know, it's so clearly forced and it's so clearly contrived. And the thing is, there's plenty of people that will go along to get along, but as soon as you actually step on something that they want, or you prevent them from getting something they want, they're just going to turn on you. Like and it happened over a Harry Potter game. Like you told them, oh, you can't have this Harry Potter game. It's bad. If you if you buy this, you're morally evil, you're morally wrong. And everyone was like, yeah, I don't think so, man. It's just a Harry Potter game. Calm down.
You know what that
Whereas,
sounds like? It sounds like the fundamental Christians telling you can't watch it because
right?
you're approving witchcraft. So it's funny how it is a religion in many ways.
Mhm.
Wokeism and all of that is a total religion because the commitment to it is similar. But yeah, you're saying that, and yeah, Witcher's a great example. The latest game that's getting this treatment before it's even come out is Final Fantasy 16, and the producer had to. We gave in my opinion, a fantastic explanation. It was very it's like, hey, you're just stating the obvious, but he did it in a very eloquent way, which was like, I don't think you can poke a lot of holes in this. But it's just like, hey, we based this story, the story we wanted to tell, on like classic European fantasy, which means people are going to look European. This is a Japanese guy from a Japanese developer developing a game. And it's like, well, people are like, where are the black people? And I'm just like, dude, you know what I want to know? Where's the FUBU of the video game industry? Where are the great black creators coming out and making stuff that makes me, a white guy, want to go watch them and be like, hey, wow, I want to be that cool. It's so in some way so insecure of like, hey, like we don't trust our own storytelling, or we don't have anything to offer, and so therefore we're going to just interject our culture into everything. Or our worse, the culture part is one thing, the race part is one thing, and it's like, I don't like it, but I'm not like shook to my core morally about it. But when we talked about this last time we talked about comics, but then starting to like reinfuse comics with, oh, hey, so-and-so is homosexual and so-and-so is, non-binary, and putting these like sexual preferences and everything into is like a whole other level. Right. And that's where we are.
Yeah. It's funny, the Japanese developers, they just ought to ignore everything. Don't say anything. Just make your game, because you know what happened the last time you just made games? You saved the video game industry.
Mm-hmm.
The Americans had destroyed it with Atari, had destroyed it. Like they had oversaturated the market. Nobody wanted games. It was a bad taste in everyone's mouth. People lost money. Like they had worthless stuff, and nobody wanted to play games. They couldn't even sell video games. And then the Japanese are like, well, let's just make the Nintendo, man. Let's just like, Nintendo's like, let's just make the Nintendo Entertainment System and we'll sell it as a toy. And then everybody plays this game called Final Fantasy. And now, and you're 16 games later, 30 years later, it's still a relevant franchise. Just don't say anything. And what's funny is, bring it back to Hogwarts Legacy, it proves that if you just don't say anything, don't acknowledge it, don't apologize, we hear you, we hear what you're saying, and we're going to do better. Or, we don't actually, J.K. Rowling didn't actually write this game, no, just don't say anything. Let the battle fight well away from you, and let quality win out. Because ultimately, Hogwarts Legacy is an okay game. It's fun. You've given it a good review. My wife likes playing it. Most people seem to like it. Just let quality win out. And that's what will happen. One of the things that is a problem when you have these cultural battles and is people producing bad stuff and supporting it to own the other side. We're going to own the libs by buying a bad comic, or we're going to own the libs by watching a bad Christian movie. And it's like, well, no, it's not about that. The people who make the thing have the same ideology as you. It's whether or not the people who have the same ideology as you make a good thing.
Yeah. Yep. I agree.
And that's something where it's more important to me to do everything to the glory of God. Can I read Harry Potter to the glory of God? I feel that I can. I think that I can. Can I make a piece of art to the glory of God? You as a musician, can you play a song to the glory of God? Yes. Soli Deo Gloria. Just thinking that's all you need to worry about. That's all you need to do. Does this glorify God?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I do think a lot of this stuff kind of works its way out in the market, just in general. Like, I think we've seen the death in many ways of a lot of film and ideas that have come and gone because they've been married to that bad writing, bad storytelling, bad ideology. I think the only thing that's really snuck its way through has probably been The Last of Us most recently, even though that, like, I'm somebody, again, this is just on the topic, not about Harry Potter, but about the topic of inclusive. I'm somebody who thought The Last of Us, my first playthrough of that, I was like, this is one of the best games ever made, period. Like, it elevated storytelling in video games to another level in terms of like cinematic storytelling. And then you have the DLC, you find out Ellie's gay. Then you have to find the second game. You find out there's a trans person there. They go even deeper with the gayness. The show comes out. They take a character who is like hinted at being gay and totally make a whole gay love story into it. And it's just like, and now you're just like, okay, well now all the like
the secret gay, I call it the
secret
gay. It's like Stranger Things.
Like the emperor has no clothes. Like he just, all of a sudden it's just like, yeah, this isn't what I loved about this game, was all this other crap. But now you're just showing like your true colors essentially. And now I have like less interest in that, as somebody who would have, if that had just been left alone, or if that hadn't been the emphasis of it, I would have just been like, this is, everybody should play this game. But now you're tying all this other junk to it.
It's like you played Metroid and nobody was like, oh, I wonder if Samus is a lesbian. Like, I need a Samus love story here. Like, either, like, who cares? I'm shooting aliens.
Yeah.
Like, Stranger Things season 2 or season 3 with the girl that
the lesbian girl
Steve works with at the ice cream parlor.
Another totally like weird out of
nowhere. You're like, awesome, this cool girl. She's way better than that other girl. Man, Steve really dodged a bullet. He gets the good end of the deal here. He dodged a bullet of that other girl, and this girl seems way more cool. Oh, now I'm a lesbian. It's like,
yeah, of course, because like, oh, hey, well, that's the thing to do. If they're cool and they're a good character, then they have to be gay or lesbian. Yeah. If they're like evil, right, then they can be a Christian. Even freaking Rainn Wilson, who is, I'm not a believer at all, was out there and like talking about The Last of Us, where it's like, I think Hollywood has a lot against Christians. Like, can't they just make like a Christian guy who's like wants to help people? It's like, no, he's always like a secret pedophile / cult leader, you know? One of these days we're gonna do a podcast. We're gonna grab Jerry and Andrew, and I want to do a cultish crossover, and I want to talk about cultish video games like Far Cry 5, and those games that are like all about that. But I pushed this over our hour limit. This was a really good conversation. I like this stuff, and I like it when we can get into this. Touching on wokeism and inclusivity and all this stuff, I think is
forced inclusivity, forced diversity. Yeah. That's the problem. Is like natural.
Sure.
Like, nobody's mad when the cast of Mass Effect has different races and all these things, because it makes sense, like they're aliens.
It was never even a thing. Like,
no one cared. No one cared. No
one cared when we grew up. Like I just remember, I remember growing up in high school and being like, oh yeah, man, those guys in the 60s that were getting blasted with hoses by police officers. Yeah, that's what racism looks like to me. And people getting lynched and beaten. And you're like, but now it's just like, hey, if you don't put me in your movie, then you're as dirty as all those people. So anyway,
if a redhead doesn't become a black person.
Well, you're at a disadvantage with no soul as it is. Exactly. Daniel, I appreciate you coming on, man.
Absolutely.
I want to do this more often, and we can talk off air about what that might look like. But yeah, it's good to have you on. And I do encourage people that are fans of Harry Potter. I think you guys are pretty safe to buy that. It is, I think, a teen-rated game, so use your best judgment. And there is a trans character in there. Not a major part of the game, pretty skippable, but if you're weary about that stuff, you should just know about it. Otherwise it was good. I liked it a lot. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else comes out. But yeah, any parting words, Daniel?
Play the games the way you want to play them.
And until next time, I don't say this phrase anymore. I'm just going to say goodbye. See you guys next time.